Greetings and welcome back. I'm now turned to the last page or the last of the lectures, although I'm not sure that I can get this whole section into one tape. It may be two recordings, but we'll see. I'm going to try to do it in one, and if I fall short, then there will be a short second tape. It's probably misnamed French Elections, Education, and Business because I actually did talk at some length about elections earlier. But I do want to review one thing, and then I do want to take Roskin to task on one thing. There is a section in the reading where Roskin claims that France suffers from referendum madness. I would ask you to examine the evidence. If you take a look since de Gaulle left the presidency, there have only been, excuse me, oh, bless me. There have only been 5 of them since de Gaulle left the presidency in 1969. So the way that I look at that is there have been approximately 5 decades in 5 referendums. So to me, is that referendum madness where you average one referendum every 10 years? I just don't see the evidence for that. Of course, the most famous of the referendum since de Gaulle left the presidency was one that changed the Constitution in a fundamental way. That was the referendum that changed presidential terms from 7 years to 5 years and created the 2-term limit. And so that was done by referendum. And, you know, I actually think that that was probably a pretty good change. If you look down at your notes, I've already covered this, but just like in French presidential elections, in French legislative elections, a candidate needs a majority on the first ballot to avoid the runoff. It has never happened in a presidential election. There have always been 2 rounds of voting. And in the vast majority of legislative seats, you also have 2 rounds. I pointed out that in 2017, only 4 of the 577 seats that were won in the National Assembly were actually won on the first ballot. Even though your book points out that the Socialists are the largest party in the National Assembly, I would just ask you to remember that there was a presidential election in 2017 after your book was published. There was also a legislative election after your book was published. And of course, Macron's party, the new party in March, and their allies control the National Assembly as well as the presidency. I want to turn a little bit to French education, and French education is kind of intriguing. Like Great Britain, France is a unitary state, which gives the national government a lot more power for rational administration. Keep in mind that the United States, and when we get to Germany next, in our country and in Germany, education is seen as more of a local prerogative. If you take a look at the French educational system, there are some aspects where the French look very, very good, but then there are some aspects where the French don't look as good. So to take a look at some of the strengths of the French educational system. National standards are very high. They're very demanding. Your book talks about the national examinations that result in many students failing and having to repeat a year. They don't have the social promotion that we have in the United States. The lycées, or the academic high schools, have competitive admission, very demanding curriculum. The French do an excellent job in terms of admissions to higher education. Roskin points out that 45% of French 20 to 24-year-olds are full-time students, which is the highest rate in Europe and very, very comparable to the United States. The French specialize in kind of these what Roskin calls schools for grinds. These are actually schools that are designed to train bureaucrats, and the ENA would be the premier school for bureaucrats. It was a school that was designed by de Gaulle to promote a university that would train individuals for public service. Despite all of those positives, there are some negatives. Interestingly, the number one takeaway for me is that if you take a look at a ranking of universities around the world, there is no French university that makes the top 40 global universities in the rankings. I decided to do a little additional research beyond Roskin. I used the Times Higher Education from England as my European source. I used U.S. News and World Report to be my American source. And if you take a look at both the European as well as the American source, American universities dominate the top 40. Although if you take a look at both the American and European index, I talked about this earlier when I talked about Great Britain, Oxford and Cambridge. Remember Oxbridge, the schools that train the British intelligentsia, that train British politicians and leaders in business and economics. They're in the top universities in the world. So according to U.S. News and World Report, the American source, they rank Oxford and Cambridge number 5 and number 6 in the world. They have Harvard, MIT, UC Berkeley, and Stanford as the top 4 ranked universities in the world. Britain had 5 of the top 40 universities in the world. If you take a look at the European ranking, Oxford is ranked as the 3rd best university in the world, in Cambridge as the 5th best university in the world. Britain had 5 of the top 40 in their index as well. Germany had 1 university that was ranked in both the American and British rankings. Japan also had 1, but none came from France. When I talked about Britain, I said that Britain had a very lopsided system. That on the one hand, they had an excellent education system for the elite, for the well-to-do. That system of private schools, which they call public schools, those elite boarding schools that led into Oxford and Cambridge. And so the top students from upper class families had amongst the best educations in the world. I told you the big lag in Britain, remember, was that only 65% of 17-year-olds were still in school, which was the lowest rate in Europe. So for the creme de la creme of society in Britain, the educational system was superb, but for most people, they were left behind. In France, it's kind of the opposite. There isn't really an elite university system unless you want to become a bureaucrat and you want to go to one of the grand écoles, one of those specialized elite bureaucratic schools. But the French do offer tremendous opportunities for the children of France to go to college, to go to university, to get a degree, and certainly they perform at a rate that is very, very comparable to the United States. So both the British and the French have good and bad aspects to their educational system. The last thing that I want to turn to of a major nature is French labor and business. And one of the things that Roskin hints at, but doesn't really describe very much, is that unemployment is the real bugaboo in France. When we talked about Britain in lecture, Roskin and I emphasized that the big problem in Britain was relative and then absolute decline economically. The French have had a very stubborn unemployment problem. Unemployment in France is 2 or even 3 times the American level. And one of the things that is different about the French labor force from the American, from the British, and even the German labor force is that while a fifth of French workers are in public sector jobs, only 1/7 of American and British workers are, and only 1/6 of German workers. So to follow along in your notes, French labor is less unionized than the United States. It's about a third less. Only about 8% of the labor union force is unionized in France. It's 12% in the United States. It's about 25% in Britain. If you go to Sweden, it's about 50%. The labor unions that exist in France are not very successful because they're very radicalized. As you can see in your notes, the largest union is the communist CGT. The unions of Germany, Sweden, and particularly, I would claim, the United States are much more moderate. Unions, particularly in America, work on wages, on working conditions, on benefits. The French unions obviously do these things, but they're much more militant. They are much, much, much more political. French business does not have an advocate like the CBI in Britain, and as a result, interest group demands are largely ignored by bureaucrats. And keep in mind that French, along with Japanese bureaucrats, are the most powerful bureaucrats in the world. Just a couple of loose ends to conclude this last tape on France. France is the #2 exporter in the world, and probably they benefit more from the European Union than any other group in Europe. About 40% of the European Union budget goes for the common agricultural, the CAP as it's called. French farmers get a lot of subsidies from this union. On the last page of your chapter, Roskin also points out that the French have the #1 ranked healthcare system in the world, even though they spend 50% less on healthcare per capita than does the United States. I do want to add in the last 2.5 minutes of this tape something that is not mentioned anywhere in the chapter, and I think is an oversight. Roskin does not mention local governments, and I think the reason, and I'll give him, some reason why he didn't include it, although I would have. The French have one of the most centralized governments in the world, but that does not mean that there aren't local governments in France. There are a lot of them. The local governments, there are about 36,000 of these smallest units, which are called communes. They are headed by a municipal or city or town council and a mayor. These 36,000 towns in France are then grouped into 96 departments. These departments are headed by a general council and its president that are grouped in 13 regions that are headed by a regional council and its president. You don't need to know any of that. I'm not going to ask you anything about local governments, but because Roskin does not mention anything about local governments, I thought that I would give you a little flair that they do exist. There has not been a significant reform of local governments in France since the time of Napoleon, so since the early 1800s. There was a minor reform in 2015. In fact, this reform occurred very, very shortly after your textbook was published. The number of regional governments was reduced from 22 to the current 13, and this was done in a cost savings effort. And the result of changing the regions from 22 to 13 regions, it is estimated, is saving the French government perhaps 15 million euros a year. In the greater scheme of things, that's not a ton of money, but certainly the fact that the French, after almost 200 years, were willing to reform was kind of a minor miracle. So that is the end of France. we will move to Germany next.